All right, boys and girls, on this first video, we're going to look at some very basic division problems as well as some division concepts and division vocabulary. So we're really going to start getting into division over the next couple of weeks. Kind of like with multiplication, this is something where you have seen this before, so this is not brand new, but it is something that it gets a little bit harder in fifth grade. And usually, us fifth grade teachers, at least I tell my students this. This is usually one of the harder concepts that we get to at the beginning of the year. So we're definitely going to see some hard concepts throughout the year. This is probably like the first hard one in my opinion. This is the one that really will get kids confused sometimes, and I think it kind of goes back to going back to fourth grade, and it's been a while since you've divided, and so it just kind of takes some practice to get it back into your minds and getting used to it again. Let's go over this first page. So I have a few things here. First of all, I've drawn out two what I call division houses, and so I use that term. A lot of other teachers use that term because then we can say things like, well, there's something that goes inside the house and then outside the house and on top of the house. And so, a lot of kids, when they see this symbol, their brains kind of gravitate towards division, which is good. It may not always look that way, but for right now, when we get started in fifth grade, that's what we're going to use. So I have one here on the left side of the screen that I'm going to circle now, that has some vocabulary already in it. And so I'm going to start with the word dividend. So the word dividend is basically, it's kind of a tricky word to say, but you really think of the word division when you see it. That word, especially when you're thinking about division, I would want my students to associate that with the total. It is how many you have of whatever you're dealing with. So a lot of times if it's a word problem, you're going to have so many marbles, or you're going to have so many baseball cards, or you're going to have so many toys, and so that is your total, and it's what is being divided out. And so if it is marbles, maybe you have 630 marbles and you're trying to divide it into groups. And so that brings us to our next word, the divisor. The divisor is going to be how many groups you're putting it into. Are you putting it into 5 groups? Are you putting it into 19 groups? Are you putting it into 45 groups? And so to know those two terms, in my opinion, are very important, because as you get into further into the year, when we get into the harder division problems, I feel like it's good for students to know, okay, this is what I have, this is what I'm dividing by. The last term is quotient. Quotient is at the top of the house. And so kind of taking a step back, the dividend is inside the house, the divisor is outside the house, quotient's on top of the house. Quotient is your answer. And so when you are dividing and you're coming up with an answer to a division problem, that is your quotient. I'm going to use this second house over here on the right to put in a couple other terms, or a few other terms that relate to division, but also relate back to multiplication. And so I'm going to write something inside the house here. I'm going to write the word product. And so when you are thinking about a division problem, a lot of times at the end of doing a division problem, you can come back and really link it to multiplication. And that is because when you are dividing, you're really thinking about your quotient, whatever you get, times the divisor, whatever you're dividing by, should give you your dividend. And so if I relate that to multiplication, there are some words here that we're going to see quite a bit in fifth grade. And that might be, whereas your product is really kind of like your dividend. It is the larger number, and then you have two factors. You have something multiplied by something else to give you your product. So you have factor times factor that would give you your product. And so I always try to tell that to my students when we start division. to relate those two things together, because these words are very important. And when they show up, sometimes they might show up in a word problem. You have to know what they mean. You can't be lost. You can't see the word quotient and then freeze up and not know what that means. And so I always start my notes with that. The next thing we're going to look at is what's called a mnemonic code. A mnemonic code is something where you have a saying, and a lot of times, it's a silly saying. It's kind of strange, or it doesn't really relate to math so much unless you make it relate to math. So it's kind of like this, and this is a pretty common one. I know there's probably some fourth grade teachers that use this. But basically, this mnemonic code here are the steps for division. This is what you would want to memorize in order to learn your steps for a long division problem. And so for a mnemonic code, the first letter in every word has some other meaning. So does represents divide. So your first step on a division problem is going to be divide. McDonald's is going to represent multiplication, or to multiply. And so the M represents multiplication. The S, you are going to sell, does McDonald's sell, or you're going to subtract. Does McDonald's sell cheese? The C, I've heard a couple different ways for this one. I use the word compare. I always tell my students to compare, and we're going to see that here in a second. So does McDonald's sell cheese? And then the last one represents you're going to bring down. So you're going to bring down your digits in a division problem. And so, again, pretty common one. You guys probably remember something like this from fourth grade. I use this one in my class. I think a lot of the fifth grade teachers use it in their classrooms. And the thing about it is, it's fun. It's kids have a good time trying to memorize it. The thing about it is, if you know it, that's great. But if you don't know how to use it, there's really no point. And so I always tell my students, hey, we got to learn it, that's for sure. But just memorizing it is one thing. Memorizing it and knowing how it's, how you use it in a problem is another. And so it's very important to be able to do both. This next page, we're going to look at an actual division problem, what's known as a long division problem. And so I'm going to take you through this, and we're going to practice it a little bit here because it probably has been some time since you have divided. So I'm going to try to go through this problem with you, and I'm going to think about does McDonald's sell cheeseburgers? So I'm going to write that off to the side. I'm not going to write all the words out, but I'm going to definitely write the first letters there. And I'm going to go through it on this problem, which is 595 divided by 5. Let me start with this. So a lot of times when kids read problems, they read them incorrectly. A big misconception would be if a kid read this problem, they would say 5 divided by 595, when it's the opposite. You always lead with your dividend. So you're taking 595 and you're dividing it out into 5 groups. And so your job here, when you're really breaking this down and you're thinking about division, is, okay, when I look at this problem, this kind of takes me back to that first page with factor and product. I have a factor of 5, and really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find another factor up top that I can multiply 5 by that gives me 595. I mean, that's really what your goal is when you do a long division problem. You are trying to find out how many times will that divisor go into that dividend. In other words, how many times will 5 go into 595? Your goal is to get exactly 595. In other words, you're trying to find something that equally goes into 595. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes you can get close. A lot of times in my classroom that I catch myself saying that a bunch, especially when we start division. You want to get close but not go over. And so we're going to try this one, and we're going to go through the steps here. And the best thing I could tell you is just watch and practice with me, because it is definitely something that if you want to be good at division, you have to practice. So first step here would be I want to look at this problem and I want to ask myself, can 5 go into 5? So I'm going to underline those 2 digits so you know where I'm at. Basically, I'm looking at this. This is my first step. I'm going to write it out to the side. It's almost like a 1-by-1 division problem. How many times will 5 go into 5? And then this is where you have to be really solid with your multiplication facts. Because when you're looking at this, in your mind, you're thinking, okay, 5 times what gives me 5? And your goal is to get exact, not go over it. Well, 5 can go into 5 one time. But instead of having to write all this out to the side, I'm just going to do it all in my problem over here. So if I relate what we just did to does McDonald's sell cheeseburgers, what we're really taking care of here is we're taking care of the division, the D, and really we're about to take care of the multiplication. Because now that I can tell myself it could go in one time, well, 5 times 1 is 5. And so I'm going to write 5 underneath. And so now I'm at subtraction. So my next step is I'm going to subtract. 5 minus 5 is going to give me 0. This is always a tricky one for kids, and that is the C, or the word compare. So does McDonald's sell cheese? The word compare in math, we're really going to be comparing 2 things at this point. We're comparing the 0 to the 5 in the divisor. And what I tell my students is this, sometimes it's just it's second, it kind of becomes second nature, and you kind of skip this step. But it really is an important step, because when you subtract, you have to ask yourself, well, there's a few things I would want a kid to think about here. First of all, if they subtracted and if they got a bigger number than the divisor. Let's say you subtracted there and you didn't get a 0, you subtracted there and you got an 8. Well, that's a problem. That should never happen. 2 things maybe would happen. Either a kid would have an issue subtracting and they subtracted wrong, or they had an issue with their division from back when we did the division and the multiplication part. So like when we did how many times will 5 go into 5, maybe they messed up on that part. And so it is a good step. Like I said, it sometimes gets overlooked because you get going when you really learn division, you'll get rolling through these problems and they won't be anything at all once you really learn how to do it. But at the beginning, it's always good to stop and think, well, okay, when I subtract, is that answer lower than my divisor? And in this case, it is, so we're good. 0 is lower than 5. Okay, so now we're to the last step, which is bring down. And so I'm going to bring down this next digit here, which is a 9. Okay, at this point, this is how I teach my students. At this point, it's almost like you go back to the top. You go back to does, or you go back to the word divide. And at this point, I like showing it like this sometimes, where I'm going to draw a new house. And it's almost like that 5 is going to stay with me. My new problem now is going to be 9 divided by 5. Or how many times will 5 go into 9? And so at this point, I'd have to go back to my math facts. I'd have to think about my 5s again. Well, 5 times 1 is 5. 5 times 2 is 10. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I want to get close, but I don't want to go over. So I can't go in twice. 5 times 2 would give me 10. That's 1 too many. So I have to think about only going in once. 5 times 1 again is 5. And at this point, really all division turns into is just repeated steps. You just do the same thing over and over and over. And pretty much if you're doing it right, it's going to look like repeated subtraction. Because at this point, I am now to the subtraction part again. 9 minus 5, if I look at that problem, is going to give me 4. I would ask my students, is 4 less than 5 the divisor? Yes, it is, so we're still good. And then now we're going to bring down. And so now I'm going to have the problem of 45 divided by 5. Well, bigger number, but nothing real scary if you know your facts, because if you know your facts, you should know that 5 will equally go into 45. You just have to know them. That's the thing. And so I would ask my students that question: how many times does 5 go into 45? The answer to that would be 9, because 9 times 5 is 45. So my 9 goes up top. And then I'm going to run out of room here, but it would look like 45 underneath, and you would subtract one more time, and you would get 0 at the bottom. And so I would look at this as, okay, I have figured out my quotient. My quotient is 119. In other words, I'm thinking I had 595. I can think of it as breaking it into 5 groups, and in each of those groups, I had 119 of whatever it might be. Again, I think I said marbles earlier. If I had 595 marbles, that's a lot of marbles, but if I had that many marbles and I put them into 5 groups, in each of those groups would be 119 marbles. So I could equally separate those. I could reverse it. I could think, well, if I had 595 marbles, I could have 119 groups. And then in each of those groups, there would be 5, because this is a problem where 5 equally went into 595. And so it kind of, you'd go back to multiplication at this point. You'd think to yourself, okay, if I really wanted to check my work, I'm going to write it out here to the side, but 119 times 5, if I were to do that problem, that would give me the answer of 595. And that's how I check my work. And that's how you can relate division to multiplication. They really go hand in hand with one another. And you probably will check some of your work that way. I know I make my students check their work. And so that's a great way to always make sure you're good with your division. And so that's one example of what I would call a 3x1. You have a 1-digit divisor. That's where that comes from. And so let's go practice one more. This problem is 637 divided by 4. This time I'm not going to write a lot of the stuff on the sides. I'm just going to really focus in on what I'm doing here. I am trying to see how many, I'm dealing with 4s at this point. I'm thinking about my facts of 4s, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to really break this down into how many times can 4 go into 637. And I'm not going to try to sit there and count up by 4s all the way to 637. That would be crazy. But I can think about breaking it apart. So I'm going to start by how many times will 4 go into just 6. I'm just thinking about that first step here. And so 4 can't go into 6 equally, but it can go in and it can get close. Again, you want to get close but not go over. It can only go in once. So underneath, I'm going to think about, I just divided. So that's the does part. McDonald's, I'm going to multiply. 4 times 1 is 4. All right, that goes underneath. I'm going to now subtract. 6 take away 4 gives me 2. And then now I'm thinking about comparing. Is that 2 less than my divisor 4? And the answer is yes. So I did something right. Now I'm going to bring down. And so my second division problem, it kind of just starts back over. I'm going to write it like that, is 23 divided by 4. And so I've got to know my 4s. And I've got to sit there and think how many times. Again, think of the language that I'm using. How many times? I'm really thinking about a math fact here. How many times does 4 go into 23? Well, I don't think it can go in equally. It can get close. 6 times 4 is 24, but it's too much. Can't go over. So I'm going to back up 1, and I'm going to think 5 here. 5 times 4 is 20. That's pretty close. Didn't go over. I'm going to subtract. I'm going to get a 3 here. 3 is less than 4, so I'm good. And then now I'm going to bring down the 7, and I'm going to have one more division problem here. 37 divided by 4. Okay, this would be the hardest one at this point because now I'm dealing with bigger facts of 4. And so I really would have to stop and think about my 4s and how many times 4 can go in. Some teachers, I know my wife does this in 4th grade in her classroom. Some teachers will make you write your 4s out to the side. And, I'm not going to do that, but maybe that's the strategy you have to do. And if that's the case, that's fine. Uh, Potentially, if you learn all your multiplication facts, you don't have to do that. That's the one wonderful part about learning your facts is it makes your life easier. So learn your facts and you don't have to do that extra work. And so I'm going to go ahead and say it here. 4 can go into 37 9 times because 4 times 9, if you know your facts, is 36. And I got really close there. And so I'm going to have a 1 that is what is basically left. It is left over. Now, at this point, this should have been something that popped up last year in 4th grade. This is one where 4 could not go into 637 equally. It was very close to going in because there's only 1 left over. And last year, you probably learned your leftovers as remainders. Now, we're going to have a lesson on what remainders are, and it's going to be called interpreting remainders, and we're going to get to that. But for today and just for practice, we're just going to say there was 1 remaining there. So again, if you go back to groups and you're thinking about, I'll use, I don't know, we'll use, like maybe you collect rocks and you have all these cool rocks everywhere and you have 637 rocks. Well, if you had 637 rocks and you had these 4 big boxes to put them in, well, then you might be thinking, okay, can I equally put them in each box? Well, 159 could go in each of the 4 boxes, but then you'd have one of the rocks just kind of left out. And so you couldn't equally get the same number in each box. You'd have one that was kind of left out to the side. And that's what, in this case, the remainder 1 could be. And so kind of taking a step back here, going back to the first page, it's still important, when you're dividing to learn the vocabulary, learn, if there's language being used in math, you're going to be lost if you hear that language and you don't know what it means. You have to understand the vocabulary. So learn those words, learn those steps, if it is the mnemonic code that you have to write out and you have to use that, learn that because that is a big help. And then probably most importantly, at least in my opinion, is learn those multiplication facts, because if you don't know your facts, you can't divide. It's just that simple. And I say you can't, it's going to be very hard for you to divide. And your classmates are going to leave you in the dust because they know them and you don't. You got to learn those facts.